you. Hi, I'm Amy Hildreth Chen, the author of Placing Papers, the American Literary Archives Market, which is forthcoming next month, June 2020, from the University of Massachusetts Press. If you would like to check out the book, you can go ahead and follow the URL listed on this slide. And you can also hit me up on Twitter at Amy Hildreth Chen. I'm pretty active, so I look forward to seeing you there. I will try to answer questions if I see them during the presentation. Otherwise, we will address them at the end, okay? I'm very honored that you came, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. This has been a long project for me, so I'm delighted to be able to share it with you. So I'm here to discuss Placing Papers, the American Literary Archives Market, forthcoming from the University of Massachusetts Press in June 2020. To start, I'll give you a brief introduction of who I am, as my background informed my ability to see the significance of this topic and overcome some of the research challenges I faced. I obtained a PhD in English in 2013 from Emory. There I worked for Kevin Young as a curatorial assistant. I learned how important literary archives are, not just to researchers, but to writers and families who depend on them for financial support. I began to see the complex world that moves these personal papers from their original creators to reading rooms. And I noticed how little was said about the people and processes that made that transition possible. In the literary archives market, those who create the commodity, authors, have only one opportunity to make a deal. Their papers, which document their life and work, typically are sold together as a single collection. Researchers and the public prefer to work with and to visit complete holdings. Researchers find the expense and time required to view multiple collections at geographically dispersed repositories too costly, while the public is less motivated to see a small set of materials. Likewise, repositories also prefer to purchase complete collections as institutions gain more prestige from major acquisitions. As a result, stakes are high. Many writers decide to use executors, such as literary agents or manuscript dealers, to help them obtain the best price. After all, their families often depend on financial support such sales provide. But the pressure is not just on authors and their representatives. Buyers also only have one chance to obtain their preferred collection. Library directors are keen to make newsworthy acquisitions that will enhance their institution's reputation. Subject curators know it is rare to gain the opportunity to add to their holdings significantly with a single purchase. And while archivists and digital archivists work for repositories to organize and provide access to collections once they are successfully obtained, they know that notable holdings can bolster their career, especially if incoming materials present cultural or technological challenges that will allow them to learn and advance professionally. These stakeholders' concerns represent only their immediate motivations. Market participants are driven by history too. Authors may know that others who sold their papers for top dollar to prestigious places, and they may hope to equal or even best their literary peers. Agents and dealers need to keep their businesses viable, which depends not only on continuing to represent the most important writers, but also on maintaining positive and mutually beneficial relationships with repositories. Directors and curators must watch their budgets to ensure that they can make as many significant acquisitions as possible, and their job is to identify the repository's pre-existing strengths and build holdings over the course of their career that develop and expand those fields. Trained to imagine themselves as supporting the work of researchers in the interest of the public, archivists increasingly recognize that their interventions shape what documents are preserved and thus what narratives can be written. And researchers and the public come to collections and repositories with preconceived notions of how these collections can be interpreted. These stakeholders' current motivations and previous experiences generate a dynamic trade in literary papers. Within the United States, this market for collections of contemporary authors began in 1955 and continues today. While each collection is as unique as the writer who created it, the market's overall shape and direction can be tracked to show how it evolved from a trade that cheaply met the needs of a new, large generation of researchers following World War II into the multi-million-dollar market seen today. Placing Papers, the American Literary Archives market, documents this history by identifying the present and preceding needs of its stakeholders to argue that in the future, the market will consolidate around the most privileged members of each group of stakeholders in a phenomenon that's widely known as the Matthew effect. This talk focuses on the stakeholders I've highlighted in red. These are the middlemen. And no, I'm not being sexist, they are all men. So this is Glenn Horowitz, and he's a rare book dealer. Glenn Horowitz began his business in 1979 in New York. He wanted to combine his family's history of selling things with his interest in literature. Horowitz's big break came in 1983 when he helped W.S. Merwin transfer his papers to the University of Illinois for $185,000. At this point, Horowitz found the benefit of targeting buyers with what he called deep champagne pockets. By 2016, Horowitz would represent 9 Norton Anthology of American Literature writers. And so these are writers that are in the data set that I used to generate the book, and authors that were not included in this data set. So, for example, Horowitz transferred Nabokov's papers to the New York Public Library for $1 million in 1991, and Nabokov is not in the data set that I used. David Mamet's papers to the Ransom Center for $1.7 million in 2007, Alice Walker's to Emory for $1 million in 2007, and Bob Dylan's to Tulsa, Oklahoma for between 15 and 20 million in 2016. The profits from these sales allowed Horowitz to expand to a second location in East Hampton. Horowitz's success came with detractors. Martin Taylor of the Fales Library at New York University claimed Horowitz inflated his prices. Yet when the United States Securities and Exchange Commission investigated his sales, the commission was concerned not that he marked up the papers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt from $3.5 million in 2003 to a handy $8 million in 2004, but that his buyer purchased the papers with his employer's money. Although he rarely discusses his philosophy as a dealer, Horowitz said in 2000 that he does not see the literary archives market conforming to the classical model animated by a willing seller and a willing buyer dynamic that Stephen Ennis, the director of the Harry Ransom Center, wishes to portray. And we'll be discussing Stephen Ennis in just a little bit. Instead, Horowitz argues that the literary archives are valuable because they are non-fungible and non-liquid assets. Non-fungible assets are goods that are unique and cannot be exchanged. Writers' papers are non-fungible at both a micro and macro level. Each manuscript is a unique item, so it is non-fungible because one manuscript cannot be substituted for another. The entire collection is then non-fungible because that set of papers cannot be found anywhere else. Non-liquid assets are those that cannot be immediately translated into currency, which is correct, as the financial value of writers' papers is predicated not on their intrinsic worth, but on the bookseller or literary agent's ability to convince a buyer to pay a certain price. Repositories' interest and their ability to buy fluctuates depending on a broader set of circumstances, which highlights the status of collections as non-liquid assets. As a dealer, Horowitz stated that his role is to broker a marriage between an uninformed seller, the generator of papers or the party who has inherited the papers, and a likely but unsuspecting purchaser, the research library. While this statement could seem derogatory, it communicates a common and fundamental problem that economists describe as asymmetric information. So now we're going to move to another stakeholder in the literary archives market, Andrew Wiley, who is a literary agent. Literary agents became a profession in England during the late 1800s when shifts in law and technology began to hurt authors' ability to make a living. Steam printing in the 1840s, the abolition of the newspaper penny tax in 1855, the elimination of the paper duty in 1861, and the invention of linotype machines in 1886 radically increased the number of available publications. As competition increased, publishers began to experience revenue losses and needed to find a way to retain their profit. And what worked best was paying authors less. The era's authors then turned to literary agents. Literary agents found their niche by interpreting the law for the financial benefits of authors rather than publishers. This choice made them unpopular. Henry Holt described all agents as contemptible interlopers and pests. And these complaints arose because previous business conventions benefited the publisher. Agents forced the power dynamics to become more equitable. Instead of admitting that agents threaten their bottom line by advocating on behalf of writers, publishers focused their attention on the behavior of agents and criticized them for acting in an ungentlemanly manner. Revealing that literature was a commodity just like any other violated the discursive norms of publishing, a mindset that sociologists would describe as a habitus that required treating literature as if its profit margin did not matter. Agents dispensed with this protocol by buying and selling copyrights, much as a cotton broker bought and sold cotton. As agents saw copyright as a good, they were not inclined to indulge in polite behaviors suggesting that publishing literature was anything more than just another business. But this attitude cost them social capital. Criticism directed at literary agents compounded after 1976, when the United States decreased the tax benefit authors could claim from donating their collections. The 1969 Tax Reform Act had allowed full tax deductions for literary estates in paragraph 1221, which specified that a literary, musical, or artistic composition, a letter or memorandum, or similar property held by a taxpayer whose personal effects created such property could leave such papers in his estate, and heirs could claim a full tax deduction for them. Accordingly, authors and their executors often were persuaded by these benefits to donate rather than sell their papers. When the law changed in 1976, authors had less incentive to donate. Andrew Wiley is the most well-known agent in the literary archives market. Wiley grew up in a family of publishers and bankers. He drew from these two fields when he founded the Wiley Agency in 1980 in New York City. In 1996, he opened a second office in London. Wiley's successful business model depended on acquiring the rights to authors and then protecting those rights domestically and internationally. His approach paid off. His client list reads like an international who's who of artists, fashion designers, musicians, politicians, and royalty. 13 of the Norton writers who were from my data set appear in his client list. His means of obtaining these authors by seducing them away from the representation that helped them early in their careers earned him the nickname the Jackal. Wiley revels in the nickname, posing for portraits like the one you see here. So obviously, he really likes his reputation. This is Harry Ransom, the founder of the Harry Ransom Center, and Stephen Ennis, the current director of the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas of Austin. Harry Ransom, an English professor and assistant dean, realized that Texas's upstart library could never match the antiquarian collections of European and Ivy League universities. Instead, he thought of a new vision. The University of Texas at Austin should collect the papers of contemporary authors. To sell his idea, he gave a lecture in which he proposed the need for a research institution in Texas that could serve as the Bibliothèque Nationale of the only state that started out as an independent nation. Ransom's speech proved convincing. In 1957, the University of Texas at Austin formally established the Humanities Ransom Center, or the Humanities Research Center, the HRC. Ransom's pitch to the state of Texas was successful, not only because Texas wanted to prove that it had international cultural capital, but also because the United States as a nation was engaged in the same struggle. During the Cold War, the United States needed to portray itself as a more attractive option than the Soviet Union, culturally as well as militarily. The problem was that Europeans were wary of Americans' shallow, business-dominated culture and felt more sympathetic to the communist values. American governmental agencies exploited the global appeal of homegrown modernism to showcase how free speech led to higher artistic achievement. American artists and writers became the subject of international propaganda. So Ransom's bid to make Texas more visible as a culturally rich state was just one example of a larger scale campaign in the United States to win the Cold War through hard and soft power. And the affluence provided by oil found in Texas allowed the HRC to dominate the American literary archives market through a succession of 7 directors who collectively created an aggressive acquisition legacy. So you can see we're ping-ponging around the most important stakeholders in the market. And so we're going from Harry Ransom and Stephen Innes representing the University of Texas at Austin on the demand side. We started with the supply side, and now we've gone to the demand side, both for Texas and Yale. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Stanford. So these 2 men represent Yale. The first is Chauncey Brewster Tinker, and then the second is Donald Gallup on the right. Texas and Yale provide contrasting examples of the history of the American literary archives market. Texas began the trade with its early interest in contemporary American literature. Yale, a latecomer, steadily moved into more recent writing as it grew from a repository that concentrated on 19th century American literature under Tinker to a repository that embraced the modernists under Gallup on the right. Gallup's work was not easy. For example, when he wanted to buy Ezra Pound's papers, Gallup worried that he would not be able to find the $200,000 required to purchase the collection. Texas had the upper hand due to its deeper pockets. Gallup wondered, who are we, who own no oil wells, to find $200,000? And I have to admit, when I was doing this research, I found this hilarious that Yale was whining about Texas having more money because of oil. So archival research is great. Yale's primary donors, E.J. Beinecke and F.W. Beinecke, had little concern for the papers of 20th century authors and no particular interest in Ezra Pound. But Gallup eventually did find the money, thanks to an anonymous donor. But Texas itself had to consent to the acquisition. So Yale's president, Kingman Brewster, petitioned Harry Ransom on Gallup's behalf, asking him to defer to Yale's earlier claim on the papers. Ransom ceded his interest and allowed Gallup to make a successful bid in a relatively rare case of institutional collaboration. Gallup's dedication to Yale helped what became known as the Beinecke transition from Tinker's earlier treasure room approach to contemporary research library. But his single-minded determination came at a personal cost. Gallup led an ascetic lifestyle, which allowed him to spend all his time, day and night, in service to Yale and its collections. But Gallup was devastated when his efforts were not met by corresponding internal interest. He said that the failure of the English department faculty to properly appreciate and make use of the resources of this collection for research was a truth that he found too painful to even think about. And finally, we're going to move to Stanford, where I have a picture of this current Stanford Library, or the current Stanford University Special Collections and University Archives website. And the website is standing in to represent for William McFerrin, who has no good photos of himself on the internet. So sorry, William McFerrin, we are thinking of you. So Stanford provides an alternative to both collecting models. According to my data, Stanford neither showed an early nor a late commitment to the field, but rather a brief interest. Stanford grew its collections faster than any other repository by acquiring 5 sets of papers in the space of only 2 years. Denise Levertov in 1993, Robert Creeley, 1993, Fannie Howe, 1993, Allen Ginsberg, 1994, and Robert Pinsky, 1994. Stanford's acquisitions showcase the power of a single curator, William McFerrin, who acted quickly during a time of institutional transition. William McFerrin demonstrates that a university's successful collecting strategy often is the result of a curator's passion dovetailing with institutional support. McFerrin's longstanding interest in the Black Mountain School not only helped Stanford acquire the papers of Denise Levertov and Robert Creeley, but also allowed them to achieve renown with an even more significant acquisition, the papers of Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg's lengthy poetics are matched only by the size of his papers. At 1,000 linear feet, his collection is the largest of all of the author's holdings in my data set. Stephen Mandible Gamble's 1,059-page finding aid meticulously records the span of Ginsberg's materials, which include the obligatory journals and correspondence. That series alone takes up 380 boxes, alongside more surprising items, like a pair of sneakers Ginsberg saved to demonstrate how harsh communist Czechoslovakia was. They looked worn even when new due to being poorly manufactured. What's notable about the Ginsberg archive is its provenance, not just its size. Columbia kept Ginsberg's materials before Stanford acquired them. While this fact is not well advertised, Stanford's finding aid does offer a clue to the paper's history. In the scope and contents note, Mandible Gamble wrote, "Wherever Ginsberg's original arrangement of materials was encountered, the order was retained. However, materials previously housed at Columbia University show signs of having been rearranged significantly. As a result, several series show evidence of conflicting intellectual arrangements, one imposed by Ginsberg and his staff, another by third parties." Ginsberg's papers moved from Columbia to Stanford in 1994 because Columbia could not pay the $5 million assessed value. No university could. Ginsberg had to decide whether to split his papers or to accept a lower value for his holdings. He chose the latter, deciding that he would obtain the most profit by selling his papers to whichever institution could keep them together while paying the most. Stanford won when it offered Andrew Wiley, Ginsberg's agent, $1 million. Although this price was 1/5 of Ginsberg's assessed value and he had no connection to the institution, he accepted it on the advice of Wiley and his bibliographer, Bill Morgan. Okay, so that takes us through a sample of some of the stakeholders in the literary collections market. And like I mentioned, these are only the middlemen, the literal middlemen of the market. So I want to talk a little bit about the methodology that I came to when I was trying to find this information, and therefore how I was able to construct this book. So, but first, I want to make sure that I don't have any chats or any questions. Okay, so I do have one question from Brian Watson, thank you, which asked me, did I receive any pushback when researching this topic from men or institutions? I think that's a great question. I did not necessarily receive pushback from institutions. I did get a general question as to what kind of research I was doing. People didn't understand, and I'll talk about this in my methodology, that I wasn't interested in seeing the papers themselves. It's quite strange when you think about it to research literary archives and not actually go see the archives, but I didn't. Because what I was interested in is why the archives went to that institution in the first place. I was interested in the transfer of that content. And so I was often more interested in the institutional histories than the papers themselves. So I didn't necessarily get any hostility. It was more just a lack of comprehension of why I would approach the topic this way. And I often had to explain that I was doing it through a data-driven perspective. So I was, as I'll explain, just entering ones and zeros into a spreadsheet to find the kinds of patterns that would ultimately lead me to this history. So my second question that I've just gotten is from Catherine D. Harris. Do you think that the predominant focus on male literary authors reifies this idea of what is good literature and thereby reinforces the white male literary canon? Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the thing is my I came up with this history of the literary archives market because I was working from a specific set of canonical authors, and I defined the canon as being the Norton Anthology of American Literature. And if you define the canon differently from me, you will come up with a different history of the archive market. And in fact, I'm hoping that someone else will. I would love to get some pushback. I would love to get some different explanations, but I wanted to approach this topic in the clearest way possible. And I didn't want to have to make an argument that my assessment of the canon was better than anyone else's. I mean, I'm still a relatively junior scholar, right? So I used a teaching anthology to say, look, this is what we teach our undergrads that the canon is. And therefore, I'm going to track how much it costs for these authors to move their papers to institutions, where they put their papers. And that will give me the story that I'm interested in learning more about. And that is a relatively male-dominated canon. However, what I will say, and this is something that this talk doesn't get into too much, but if you buy the book, I do talk about it, that the benefit of being a woman, especially a woman of color, is while it took so long for them to be of interest on the market, they automatically started receiving higher values for their papers, and they went to higher ranked ARL institutions. So just to rephrase that, if you're a woman of color, probably no one bought your papers until the 90s, which is horrible. White men were starting to be bought in 1955. But your overall placement, ranking, where you went, was better. So the statistics are not necessarily always in favor of white men or white women. They just have a much longer history in the market, if that makes sense. So since I'm getting some methodology questions, I'm going to move forward, although I've got to answer Emma's question. So Emma asked me, did you have trouble gaining access to the sale acquisition information from institutions? Yes. In fact, normally I cannot access that information. It's private. So I can only access it if it was reported out to the press. So if you want to dig into my footnotes in my book, you'll see a lot of stories from the New York Times, because the New York Times tended to record the sale prices. But if it wasn't reported to the press, I couldn't get it. So, I mean, I would have loved to have done some more statistical analysis of who got paid, how much, and why. And I simply couldn't do that research because that information wasn't there. But I provided it when I could. And why, and then Emma asked a follow-up question, why do I think this information is kept so private? I think it's complicated. First off, it's really hard on writers because we live in a capitalist society. So as soon as you have prices for papers, you can go ahead and create a rank list of authors' impact. So maybe not their cultural impact, not their cultural value, but their financial value, which is, after all, how we're all measured as actors in a capitalist society. It makes it extremely hard on repositories because the price that they can pay in one year is not the price that they can pay in another year, even if they want you just as much. I mean, as we've seen with this COVID crisis, you know, the oil prices go up and down, all sorts of things. The buying power is not stable. So what makes one author worth more than another is very complicated, and we can talk about that, but it also reflects the buying power of the institutions in that particular moment. So I think it would be good to know, but I really do sympathize with the institutions as someone who's worked in institutions myself on why that's not something that they want to make public. Oh man, you guys have great questions. Okay, so Jolie Braun asked, aren't public institutions obligated to be transparent about this information? I would say I believe so. I know the Ransom Center is a public institution, has tried to push back about that information becoming public, because at the end of the day, they don't necessarily have consistent buying power. And if authors see that so-and-so got $1 million, well, then they're going to expect $1 million, but they might not be able to pay that much the next time around. Again, it gets complicated quickly. But I do want to defer that question a little bit just because I'm not a lawyer. But I will say that the amount of information I provided in my book, I pretty much got from the art market. I think the art market is much more advanced in how it thinks about artists' papers based on the sheer amount of money that visual art goes for in comparison to literary manuscripts. And then, oh, nice. I got another name to possibly note from an anonymous tip. Dr. Lola, and I'm going to mispronounce this name. It's Szladits, was the curator at NYPL for the Nabokov archive. So yeah, there's so many stories that need to be told. And there's so many stories that aren't told because usually we think about the author. We don't think about the people that make that author who we now think about today. All right, so I'm going to move on, and we can keep the conversation going. Your questions are excellent.
Hey, Erin, I'm just going to jump in and say that I know we are scheduled to end at 4:40. We'll just keep going over time today. If you need to leave early, that's totally fine. Just stay tuned for the YouTube link, and you'll be able to catch up with this later on. So
awesome. Yeah. Well, and I think what we did is we substituted some of the questions, which I think is even better. So I'm glad that we spent the time on the questions. And then, yeah, please hang in there if you can. And if not, hopefully you'll see us on YouTube. Okay, so just to move into the methodology, I wanted to just give you a hint of the stories behind the data. And I want to let you know how I got to these stories. Like I mentioned, I worked from the Norton Anthology of American Literature to create my list of canonical authors. I knew I wanted to study literary archives after watching Acquisitions at Emory. Before I thought about what made different authors come to a single institution, what made them interested in Emory, but I realized that the better story was larger, and that larger story needed to come from data. So to create a large enough sample size, I needed a selection criteria that wasn't just me and the people I was interested in. I used an anthology because I didn't want to get over a debate. I didn't want to have the basic debate of who's in the canon and who's not and why. I would love to do a meta survey of who's in the Norton and how stable their rankings are from edition to edition. But since that study doesn't exist, I'll just tell you that I used the 7th edition. Then I went to Archive Grid once I listed all my authors and I looked up where their papers were located. I gave a talk just on this in London about how our best resource to finding archives in the US is just one guy working part-time to create Archive Grid, and we should all be super thankful to him. You can also just Google literary papers for X author, but you need to do both together because you miss content if you just Google, and trust me, this happened to me. Then once I found finding aids, this one is Allen Ginsberg's on the Online Archive of California. I looked up the finding aids at each repository and I started filling in the information in my spreadsheet. And a lot of the times I did have to contact the repository for more information because it's rare that everything is on the finding aid. For example, here, California was great, or Stanford was great about providing who was the archivist, but that was not universally documented. Once I did this work for all of my authors, I had a spreadsheet that looks something like this. And so this is a spreadsheet from the Iowa Institutional Repository. The messy parts are where the lines have been wrapped around to fit into this screen, sorry. I used URLs because of finding the finding aid again is actually not that easy. And you can see that I use mainly binary, zeros and ones, but also I have ordinal numbers, which are counting numbers, which are like ARL rankings or ages, or nominal numbers, which are the archive linear feet size. And this is a plain text version of what was originally a nicer tabbed spreadsheet in Excel. I used Excel when I was writing my book, but plain text is non-proprietary. So this is how the data is stored to make it accessible to others. As a former librarian, I follow open data practices, and I want you to as well. So all of my data can be found on the University of Iowa Institutional Repository, since I worked at Iowa while I was writing this book. The data is available now, so you can check my work if you wish, or come up with your own research using my information. It's downloadable as a master list or by individual table. Just look up my name to find it, or you can contact me on Twitter and I'll provide you the link. If you do database research methods, please share your data similarly. We have nothing to hide, and we all have a responsibility to follow best practices. Sarah Schlipp asked, did the SNAC social networks and archival context database feature in my research in any way? And I will say no, it did not. Probably it should have, but I did not use that resource. So all that work then became this type of table. So this is a table from my book proof. And once those tables are created, I looked for patterns or exceptions to patterns, because the best stories are always either the most typical stories or the most exceptional stories. Once I found those patterns, I wrote the chapters beginning with the data findings and then creating the stories, some of which I began to tell here. So you can see the patterns in this table that I discussed earlier when I was talking about the collecting strategies of Texas, Yale, and Stanford. You can see that Texas is consistent and early, Yale is consistent but late, and Stanford is just one big grab. I didn't talk about Emory or Harvard, although those two universities do get coverage in my introduction and first chapter because they have a relatively smaller impact on the market. You can see here, though, that my sample size, even with data-driven methods, is quite small. So the Norton Anthology has a decent amount of authors in it, 102 for my seventh edition, but the authors that had placed papers were only 79 of those 102. So I am dealing with relatively small sample sizes. And that's why my criteria for choosing the population is really important. If you want to quibble with me, the best way to do it is for you to find a better population. Run the same data and see what you get and if it matches what I found. Have fun with that, though, because teaching anthologies are a great way to establish the canon, and I think the only way you can do my population better is to make the null meta-analysis that I suggested earlier. And to be honest, doing data-driven methods takes a long time. Simple numbers can be surprisingly hard to obtain. I had to write a lot of emails to a lot of repositories. Once you use this method, though, it's hard to look at anything the same way again. Now, to me, data is everything. So it's really turned me into a different type of humanities researcher. So to conclude, that's what I learned and how I learned it. I hope you take the opportunity to read my book when it comes out, and please also remember to support university presses during this time. Whether the University of Massachusetts Press and my book or any others, they support research and liberal inquiry, and their continued existence in this time period and during this crisis really matters to all of us. I'm so grateful for their support and for you coming here today. So thank you. And I look forward to answering more questions. And I have two right now, three. So I'll just jump in, answer from the top. Hi, Shannon. And Shannon asked, did you take donations of literary papers into account as well in your Norton Anthology data set? And how many, if any, were donated, not sold? Yes, the answer is I did take donations into consideration, and that is represented in my book in the tables that I depict. And also, if you go look at my data set, there is a column that's just donated or sold, like 1 or 0. And so that way you're able to see that, yes, not all papers were sold. However, that tax change in the 70s really meant that more authors opted to sell their papers because they could get a financial benefit from it. And then Agnes asked me, do you have any plans to update the data set to see if new players emerge in the 2020s or if COVID-19 has an effect to mix things up in repositories? That is a great question. I would love to update the data set just because there's a ton of writers that I think really are canonical, frankly, that did not make it into the data set that I used from the seventh edition. And I would be really interested in what even the 2008 crisis, the long-term tail of that crisis, and now COVID-19 has on repositories. I do think that that work will need to be done. The COVID-19 at least will need to be done like 5 years out or more. I think right now we're so in the middle of the storm, we're not going to be able to see the impact. So yeah, I mean, I would love to do that research, and frankly, I could do it a lot more efficiently now that I've done it once. There was definitely a learning curve, but we'll see. I mean, I'll admit I'm an independent scholar right now. I have a full-time job. So, you know, you want to work with me on this, let me know. So then I would like to answer Christina Colvin's question. The difference between Stanford's single grab and Texas's consistency over the decades was surprising to me. What do you think informed that difference given their respective objectives? So Texas was just a lot more transparent about their collecting interests from the beginning. From the beginning, they were incredibly insightful about how they were going to make themselves a national and international player in culture. And they knew that the Ivy League had locked up rare books. They'd locked up kind of earlier literary papers. And so did England and Ireland and the old world. So they knew that the way for them to make their mark was to collect the things that had not yet begun to be valued. And that was 20th century literature. 20th century literary studies wasn't even really a thing until the post-war generation. And a lot of people didn't respect it. So by collecting contemporary work, they were collecting something that other people weren't interested in. And that allowed them to make a lot of acquisitions for cheap, and to also be really a pace setter in the industry. So kudos to the Ransom Center for really seeing a hole in the market and making a move. And I think Stanford just wasn't there in the same way. Elizabeth Manis asks, hello, could you unpack your comment about data is everything? What is everything before the data you're talking about? Okay, so maybe I was being a little off the cuff there. For me, I think data is everything in the sense that it's easy to tell stories about things we think we know. And I have been a literary scholar. I've worked in 3 different special collections repositories at both public and private institutions. So I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what's going on from a professional vantage point. But for me, what was important is not to write stories from what I thought I knew, from what I was exposed to, was see, are my assumptions correct? For example, I was really afraid that the data was going to show that writers of color were disprivileged against white authors. And I did see that in the sense that they were not collected as early. It's a very, very white market for the first couple of decades. However, once authors of color start entering the market, they get placed at much higher tier repositories, and they're more likely to sell their papers. And so they do really well. And so it was important for me that my data didn't necessarily back up what story I thought I was going to tell. And so for me, it's a good check that I'm not predisposing my research to conclusions I might have had, that I'm really letting the information speak back to me. Mary Catherine Kinneber asked, and apologies if I mispronounce your name or others, what do you think accounts for the omnipresence of certain dealers in the market? Does this seem related to your data set, types of authors represented, or other factors your research revealed? I think that is true. I am really only discussing the top tier authors that make it into the Norton Anthology. And so if you are in the Norton Anthology, your papers are more likely to be sold. They're more likely to be sought after by top tier literary agents. And so they're just more likely to be treated in this manner. If you expand the data set to think about writers who have maybe extensive critical claim, but not as much commercial power, yeah, I think the story is going to be very different. They're going to be getting lower prices, or maybe donating their papers, or having different types of arrangements than I portrayed. I think there's a lot left to do with this type of research. And I do hope someone does that. So I think my data set is telling a very specific portion of a greater narrative. And then, yeah, I'll conclude with that. I hope that others can do more research to say what perspectives other types of authors would have. Sal Robinson asks, do you think that the existence of storage space, oh, this is good, had anything to do with these decisions because of the size of archival collections? I know that this is a concern at my institution. I want to say absolutely, but I do not have anything to back that up. I know that it was a concern at Iowa because these collections take a lot of space. Space costs a lot of money. And now that we're starting to, I know at least RBMS is beginning to think about the environmental effects of climate change, and COVID-19 is changing the financial reality of institutions. It's not cheap to store materials, just like it's not cheap to arrange and describe them. So I think there is something there. That's a really good hypothesis, but I can't say anything to that based on the work that I did myself. So it looks like we don't have any more open questions. This might be a good time to conclude if no one else has something pressing. Okay, one more. Agnes asked, were you able to determine how the dealers assign value to the collections? The short answer is no. I called Glenn Horowitz and I had access to his client list. He gave me permission to see his client list that was more extensive than was on his website. But I didn't ask how they assigned value. I do think that it's a delicate dance between the level of interest that repositories have, the funding they have available, what is in the collections. Something else that I think is really important to talk about that this book wasn't able to cover too much was the effect of born digital holdings, and whether or not that shapes the value of literary archives. So no, I didn't do that type of in-depth research into how literary agents and rare book dealers make their price adjustments, but I hope you or someone else will.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. It's been a pleasure having you. And thank you to everybody for joining us. If you want to have any closing words, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll see you for the next webinar. There's a list of the offerings coming up on our website, bipsokamer.org. And we're always here if you have questions. So thanks again, Amy.
Oh, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the great questions, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.